Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be diving in.
Have you ever stopped to think about how we know what we know about the past? I mean, not just from books, but like, how did societies without widespread writing keep their stories alive? Their laws, their identity?
Yeah, it's a huge question. And it gets right to the heart of, well, what is history, really? How's it preserved?
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we've looked at some really fascinating sources.
We have academic stuff on written records, but also exploring oral traditions globally, how people actually, collect those oral histories.
And the debates around accuracy, significance for both types.
Right. We've got insights stretching from, say, ancient Egypt right up to modern legal systems considering oral evidence. It's quite a range.
So our mission today really is to explore how these two traditions, written and oral, kind of work together.
Or sometimes against each other?
Yeah, sometimes in tension. How they shape our view of the past and honestly the present too.
We want to unpack their unique strengths, but also, let's be honest, their limitations.
Definitely. Hopefully by the end, everyone listening will have maybe a fresh perspective on what counts as history and all the ways it gets made and passed on.
Sounds good. Where should we start?
Okay, let's start at, well, the beginning for many people's understanding, the arrival of written records.
Makes perfect sense. That emergence, around the 4th millennium BCE.
Yeah.
It was a massive shift.
Tied right into the invention of writing itself.
Of course. And it's key to realize this wasn't just like jotting down lists.
No.
The very act of writing changed how societies could organize information, how they could transmit really complex knowledge. It moved beyond just what one person could remember.
Into more sort of codified systems.
Exactly.
We often think of Egyptian hieroglyphs, right? On wood, on papyrus.
Classic examples. And they weren't just pretty pictures. It was a structured communication system.
Which naturally opened up new ways for, well, formal learning, teaching.
It did. But Egypt wasn't alone, as our sources show.
Right. What were some other early examples?
Well, there's cheese writing in Ethiopia, which is significant. And the incredible calligraphy in Timbuktu during its golden age.
It's in sub-Saharan Africa, yeah.
And also the Nsibidi script from southeastern Nigeria. Pretty fascinating stuff.
And these weren't just isolated curiosities, were they? They were central to historical scholarship and education in those specific regions?
Absolutely integral. They developed within those societies for their needs.
It makes you reconsider education. One source defined it basically as transmitting values and accumulated knowledge.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it.
So even those really early inscriptions were part of that larger educational project. It's broader than just literacy.
Precisely. It's about how a society safeguards and shares what it deems essential. And as writing became more common, we start seeing different types of records.
Okay, like what?
Well, the big distinction is primary versus secondary sources.
Ah, yes. Primary is the first-hand stuff.
Exactly. Someone who was there, who experienced it. A letter, a diary entry, an official decree from the time. That's your primary source.
Gotcha. And secondary?
That's analysis built on the primary sources. So a historian today writing about ancient Egypt, using those hieroglyphs, their book is secondary.
Like Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, that classic example.
Perfect example. Centuries later, synthesizing vast amounts of primary material, or, our school textbooks. Mostly secondary.
Makes sense. What other distinctions did the sources make?
There was the idea of exclusive versus shared records. Exclusive gives you unique info you can't find elsewhere, maybe specific cultural details in one treaty.
Okay.
Shared records might cover similar ground found in multiple documents.
And then there's the official versus unofficial distinction too, right?
Right. Official records usually come from trusted sources, like government archives, national registers. Unofficial could be letters, diaries, things from individuals or groups without that formal stamp.
Doesn't mean unofficial is wrong, though.
Not at all. But you might need more verification, consider the source more critically.
Which is always important anyway, considering potential bias in any writing.
Absolutely. And the way information is written varies too. You get narrative forms, stories, biographies.
Diplomatic forms, like charters, treaties.
Exactly, the formal agreements. And then social forms, personal letters, accounts of daily life.
It's interesting that even fictional stories, like novels, can tell us so much about the society that made them.
Oh, definitely. A made-up story still reflects the values, the anxieties, the beliefs of its time. It's a cultural artifact.
Now, connecting this globally, it's important to remember writing wasn't universal early on.
Crucial point. Widespread writing came relatively late to many parts of Africa, with ancient Egypt being the big, obvious exception.
So what did that mean for their history?
It meant a much heavier reliance on non-documentary sources, oral sources primarily, which, as one source noted, makes the work of historians trying to reconstruct that past, well, more challenging in some ways.
Which leads us perfectly into the other side of this coin, the enduring power of oral traditions.
Yes. If writing wasn't always there, or wasn't used by everyone, how did societies maintain their history, their knowledge?
The spoken word.
Exactly. Oral tradition is it's the transmission of memories, knowledge, cultural expressions, held collectively by a group.
Passed down generation to generation.
Through speaking, through vocal utterance. Think about it. Before writing was common, this was the way, the only way, often.
To build societies, institutions.
Everything. And even now, with literacy widespread in many places, oral tradition is still vital. It hasn't just disappeared.
We learned some societies in Africa were even called oral civilizations.
Yes, because of the deep respect and reliance on the spoken word. The really core knowledge, politics, law, social norms, religion, it was all carried orally.
It really shows how central and powerful speech was.
And what's really interesting is the communal nature of it.
How so?
It wasn't usually just one person telling a story in isolation. Important events often had many witnesses.
Okay.
And when stories were retold, the community often played a role in checking details, correcting errors. It helps maintain accuracy.
Almost like a built-in fact-checking system.
In a way, yeah, a communal validation process, very different from a single author writing alone.
And there were even rules and rituals sometimes to protect important stories.
Yes, especially for narratives carrying significant cultural or legal weight. You'd want safeguards to prevent arbitrary changes.
Makes sense. And what about memory aids? How did people remember all this complex information?
Mnemonic devices. Crucial. The sources highlighted some fascinating ones.
Like the songlines.
Exactly. The Australian Aboriginal concept of songlines is incredible. The landscape itself becomes a memory palace, almost.
Wow.
Each path, each feature has interconnected stories and songs tied to it. So the land constantly reinforces the history and knowledge.
The land is a living library. That's amazing.
It really is. It shows these weren't just simple memory tricks. They were deeply integrated systems for encoding and retrieving vast amounts of information.
And the accuracy.
Yeah.
Those examples were just mind-blowing.
Weren't they? Aboriginal accounts of volcanic eruptions going back, 30, 40,000 years?
Yeah, and detailed knowledge of sea level changes over millennia.
Which lines up with geological findings. It seriously challenges the old assumption that oral traditions are inherently unreliable compared to writing.
So they had their own ways of verifying things.
It seems so. Sophisticated systems, even without written footnotes. Which leads to another point.
Oral footnoting.
Yeah? Narrators would often cite their source. My grandfather told me this, or the elders taught.
Like citing your references?
Exactly. Adds accountability, helps trace the lineage of the information. It's a form of citation, just spoken.
That's fascinating. But what about changes? Written history aims for a fixed record, but oral stories can vary, right?
They often do. But the sources suggest these variations aren't always errors or decay.
What are they then?
They can actually enrich the story, add context, reflect different perspectives within the community. Often, the core message, the essential meaning, stays remarkably consistent.
So it's more dynamic.
Exactly. Oral tradition is inherently dynamic, dialogic. It's an ongoing conversation within the community, adapting but preserving core truths. It lives and breathes in a way a static written text doesn't.
The meaning gets reaffirmed, reinterpreted with each telling.
Right, often responding to the community's present needs and understanding.
This really brings us to a key point, doesn't it? That maybe the divide between oral and written history isn't so clear-cut.
It seems increasingly like a misconception. They're not necessarily opposites.
More like complementary ways of knowing the past.
That's a great way to put it. And Western academia has been slowly, sometimes grudgingly, coming around to this view.
Recognizing oral history as legitimate.
Yes, and incredibly valuable. Especially for understanding the histories of marginalized groups, people whose voices might be missing from the written archives.
We read about Jan Vencena's distinction, oral history versus oral tradition.
Right. He defined oral history as contemporary accounts, people talking about things within their own lifetime.
Okay.
And oral tradition is the stuff passed down beyond living memory.
But that distinction isn't always used, is it?
No, and that's important. Stephen J. Augustine of the Micmac Nation, for example, apparently doesn't draw such a sharp line in his cultural context.
Which highlights a potential pitfall.
Exactly. Imposing Western categories like legend versus history versus story, onto indigenous knowledge systems can create artificial divisions.
Where things might be more fluid or interconnected.
Precisely. It really hammers home how vital it is to consider the original language and the specific cultural context when engaging with oral histories. You can't just apply your own labels.
And this isn't just academic theory, it has real-world weight, like in legal cases.
Huge implications. The Canadian case, Delgamuukw, British Columbia, was mentioned. A landmark.
Because the court accepted Aboriginal oral traditions as evidence.
Yes, as evidence of land title. Initially, the lower court dismissed the oral histories presented by the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en peoples, just threw them out. But the Supreme Court of Canada overturned that. They ruled that oral histories had to be given weight, especially since these societies didn't rely on written records. To ignore them would basically deny their rights.
That's incredibly significant. A precedent was set.
Absolutely. And it forced a reckoning with how legal systems treat different forms of evidence, different ways of knowing.
But it's probably still complex interpreting these histories in a Western legal framework.
Oh, for sure. There are ongoing challenges, ongoing learning needed. It requires adaptation, respect for different cultural contexts and epistemologies. It's not easy.
Right. So it's an evolving process. Now, to keep things balanced, we also need to talk about the limitations. Neither system is perfect.
Absolutely essential. Let's start with written records. They seem solid, but they have issues.
Like bias.
Definitely. A writer's opinions, their agenda, what they choose to include, or, crucially, leave out. It all shapes the record. We saw examples mentioned, like potentially biased European accounts of events elsewhere.
And once something's written down,
It can take on a life of its own, right? False information can get accepted as fact just because it's in print, especially if it's not cross-checked.
there are practical limits, too.
Yeah. Historically, writing materials could be expensive, access wasn't universal, records get lost, destroyed fires, floods, neglect.
And just plain illiteracy. For much of history, most people couldn't read the records anyway.
A huge barrier. So written records aren't infallible. What about oral traditions?
They have potential drawbacks, too. We talked about the community correction aspect.
Which is a strength.
But sources also noted storytellers can modify narratives, consciously or unconsciously.
True. Memory isn't perfect, and motivations can change.
Although, again, the counter is that community oversight often catches significant deviations.
Right. There's that tension. But research does suggest that over very long periods, oral traditions can change significantly.
How so?
Details get lost, maybe different stories merge, elements get conflated or reinterpreted.
The example given was tracing the origins of folk tales or rhymes, like Ring Around the Rosie.
Exactly. It becomes incredibly difficult to pin down the precise origin or meaning through centuries of oral transmission alone. Things shift.
Which kind of brings us to a bigger point. Maybe all historical recounting, written or oral, is shaped by more than just factual accuracy.
That seems likely. The purpose of the telling, the audience, the context,
Yeah.
it all plays a role. It's rarely just about the facts.
Which is why comparing and cross-referencing different kinds of sources is so important.
Absolutely critical for anyone trying to get a richer, more nuanced understanding of the past. Don't rely on just one type of record if you can help it.
Okay, so given all this, how do we actually go about preserving oral histories today in a more formal sense? It's not like sticking a document in an archive.
No, it requires a different approach. It's both an art and a science. Our sources, like guidelines from the Smithsonian, really emphasize careful methodology.
What does that involve?
A lot of preparation before you even talk to someone. Researching the context, understanding the cultural background.
Then the interview itself.
Respectful, ethical practices are key. Building rapport, creating a comfortable space, asking open-ended questions, listening actively.
Not just extracting information.
Exactly. And then crucially, preserving the original recordings properly, making them accessible, archiving them carefully.
And remembering that oral tradition isn't just one thing, right? It's not just epic stories.
Not at all. It's a whole spectrum. Proverbs, riddles, songs, performances, rituals, all carrying knowledge.
And in many cultures, there were specialists.
Yes. People like the Griots in West Africa who were trained guardians of collective memory, professional storytellers, and historians.
There's ongoing work just trying to categorize all these different forms and functions, too.
It's a complex field. We also touched on that idea of oral formulaic composition.
Like with Homer's epics.
Yeah, the theory that poets use recurring phrases, stock scenes, patterns, almost like building blocks, to help remember and compose these huge poems.
Like a technology of memory, embedded in the language itself.
Kind of. It shows the sophisticated techniques oral cultures developed long before widespread writing.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it feels really clear that you can't just pick one side. Written and oral traditions are both vital.
Absolutely essential for a comprehensive view. They each give us unique insights, unique windows onto the past.
And they each face their own challenges with accuracy, interpretation.
Definitely.
So the main takeaways seem to be written records give us tangible artifacts. They enabled formal education systems.
While oral traditions offer this dynamic, community-validated knowledge deeply tied to culture, place, lived experience.
And both have profoundly shaped how we understand history, limitations, and all.
Couldn't have said it better.
Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. In our world today, so saturated with digital information, constantly changing, how can we better leverage both written and oral traditions?
Good question. To preserve knowledge, history.
Yeah. What might we gain if we more actively engaged with oral histories in our communities, maybe even within our own families?
It really makes you think about the sources of your own knowledge, doesn't it? The stories that shaped your view of the world, where they came from.
And how they're still being passed on or maybe lost.
A lot to consider there.
Absolutely. It's been a fascinating exploration. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.